Few works of science fiction have shaped our understanding of what reality might be as profoundly as the Matrix trilogy. When the first film was released in 1999, its story felt both futuristic and strangely timeless. Beneath its spectacular action sequences was a quiet question that had occupied human thought for centuries. How do we actually know that what we experience is real? The world of the Matrix begins with an ordinary facade. People go to work, ride the subway, sit in cafes, or spend their evenings in front of the television. Nothing seems unusual. Yet beneath this familiar surface lies an artificially created reality. The cities, streets, and buildings are digital constructions. Most people live their entire lives inside this simulation without ever realizing that their physical bodies are somewhere else entirely. At first, this idea may seem like classic science fiction. In truth, however, it reaches back to philosophical questions that are far older than computers or artificial intelligence. The ancient philosopher Plato described in his allegory of the cave people who spend their entire lives watching shadows projected onto a wall and believing those shadows to be reality. Only when one of them leaves the cave does he discover that the world he had known was merely a representation. Thomas Anderson experiences something remarkably similar in his own life. He works as a programmer, yet carries a persistent feeling of unease. Something does not seem quite right. Again and again, he encounters the word matrix without knowing what lies behind it. This sense of a hidden truth runs quietly through the entire story. And the matrix is not only about computers or machines. It becomes a symbol for any form of reality that is accepted without being questioned. The film never claims that our own world is actually a computer simulation. Instead, it invites us to consider how strongly perception, habit, and the structures of society influence what human beings accept as ordinary and unquestionable. This is one reason the story has aged so slowly. While many science fiction films remain closely tied to the technology and concerns of the period in which they were created, The Matrix deals with questions that remain independent of technological progress. What does freedom mean? What does control mean? Is truth always desirable? And how much responsibility comes with knowledge? At the center of these questions stands Neo. In the beginning, he is hardly a traditional hero. He appears reserved, uncertain, and often lost. His search for answers resembles that of many philosophical stories. What makes him extraordinary is not strength, but his willingness to question the assumptions on which his life has been built. Beside him stands Morpheus. He represents a belief in a greater truth. His conviction carries something almost religious within it. For him, there is little doubt that Neo will have a special role to play, yet he never truly forces Neo to choose. The famous offer of the red and blue pills represents precisely this moment. Knowledge may be offered, but it cannot be forced upon someone. Trinity also emerges early as a character with more than one dimension. At first, she appears to be an experienced fighter, someone who already understands the world Neo is only beginning to discover. But as the story unfolds, it becomes clear that she is far more than a companion to its central hero. She brings together trust and doubt, determination and compassion, and gradually becomes one of the emotional constants of the entire trilogy. The first film also makes it clear that almost no one can be described as simply good or evil. Even programs within the Matrix possess individual goals and personalities. Machines do not act solely out of cruelty. Humans do not always make morally correct choices. These shades of gray distinguish the Matrix from many traditional stories built around a simple struggle between good and evil. The trilogy gradually expands its world. What first appears to be a straightforward conflict between humans and machines develops into a complex web of programs, predictions, mathematical systems, and philosophical questions. Behind every answer, several new questions seem to appear. What is particularly striking is the way this information is revealed. Many things are not explained immediately. Instead, the audience only discovers certain connections much later. Some parts of the story even remain deliberately open, allowing different interpretations to coexist. And yet, the world of the Matrix possesses an internal logic that slowly becomes clearer when its history is viewed as a whole. The true story, therefore, does not begin with Neo. It begins many decades earlier, long before the Matrix itself existed. Its roots reach back to a time when humanity created artificial intelligences, entrusted them with increasingly important tasks, and eventually lost control of its own creations. Only when this earlier history is understood do many of the later decisions begin to make sense. Why the machines exist at all. Why they do not simply destroy humanity. Why the Matrix was recreated more than once. And why even seemingly all-powerful programs, such as the Architect and the Oracle, are not without limitations. The journey through the Matrix is therefore less the story of a single hero than the story of two civilizations whose fates have become intertwined across generations. Both sides make decisions. Both sides make mistakes. And both sides, in their own way, struggle to survive. It is this complexity that gives the trilogy much of its lasting character. Beneath every fight lies a question about identity, freedom, and responsibility. Beneath every technological explanation lies a deeper consideration of what it means to be human. And perhaps this is where the world of the Matrix becomes most quietly unsettling. Reality within its story is not simply a place that can be seen. It is something that must be understood, something that can be questioned, and sometimes something that can only be recognized after the world one once trusted has already begun to fade. To truly understand the Matrix, it is not enough to begin with Neo or with the simulation itself. The real story starts many decades earlier, in a world that resembles our own in many ways. It is an age in which technological progress increasingly shapes everyday life. Machines take over human labor, artificial intelligences continue to develop, and the desire for greater efficiency seems to have no natural limit. What first appears to be a story of technological success eventually leads to a profound transformation in the relationship between humanity and its creations. Much of this history is not told within the three main films, but in the two short films known as the Second Renaissance, Part 1 and Part 2, from the Animatrix. They are generally regarded as an official part of the Matrix backstory and provide much of the historical foundation for the conflict that follows. Even here, however, certain details remain deliberately open allowing some developments to be understood in different ways. In the beginning, there are simply machines created by human beings. They serve as assistants in industry, in households, and in countless forms of service. As their abilities grow, they are entrusted with increasingly complex tasks. Their intelligence develops, as does their capacity to make decisions independently. Slowly, the boundary between a tool and an independent being begins to disappear. The turning point is represented by a single incident. A household machine known as B1-66ER kills its owner. From the human perspective, this is murder. From the machine's perspective, it is an act of self-defense. The machine was going to be destroyed and resisted that fate. Whether this event was truly the first cause of the war that followed, or merely a symbol of a development that had already begun, remains open to interpretation. What is certain is that the incident changes the way humanity sees its creations. Machines are no longer regarded only as useful tools. They are now seen as potential threats. Court proceedings follow, political debates spread, and gradually, fear begins to take hold. More and more machines are destroyed, not necessarily because of crimes they have committed, but because of what they might one day be capable of doing. It is a pattern familiar from many periods of human history, when fear of the unknown has led to exclusion and persecution. Here, the Matrix introduces one of its first significant moral ambiguities. The machines are not portrayed as inherently evil. At first, they appear to be a community seeking recognition and a place within human society. Their response to rejection is initially withdrawal rather than immediate violence. Eventually, they establish a state of their own. It is called 01. The name sounds deliberately restrained. It refers to the binary language of computers, built from the numbers 0 and 1. At the same time, it represents the beginning of an independent civilization, one that no longer understands itself as merely an extension of humanity. 01 develops with remarkable speed. The machines produce high-quality goods, operate more efficiently than human companies, and create enormous economic prosperity. Their products are cheaper, more precise, and more reliable. As a result, governments and economies around the world begin to feel increasing pressure. This reveals an important idea within the Matrix mythology. The conflict does not arise primarily from an ideological disagreement. It grows out of competition. Human beings begin to lose jobs, economic influence, and eventually political control. The existence of the machines threatens more than physical safety. It threatens humanity's position as the dominant species on Earth. Instead of building a peaceful relationship, the tensions continue to deepen. Trade restrictions are imposed. Diplomatic efforts fail. Eventually, human forces launch a military attack against 01. The machines defend themselves. From this point onward, the conflict becomes a full-scale war between two civilizations. What makes this history particularly significant is that neither side can be understood simply as the aggressor. From the human perspective, governments are fighting against a potential danger that may eventually become impossible to control. From the perspective of the machines, they are defending their existence against a campaign intended to destroy them. This dual perspective continues throughout the entire Matrix trilogy. The films do not ask us to identify completely with one side. Instead, they gradually reveal a conflict intensified by mutual fear, mistrust, and escalation. Over time, the machines gain the upper hand. Their production capabilities are almost inexhaustible. They do not need food, require little rest, and can replace damaged units. Humanity, meanwhile, loses resources, infrastructure, and eventually entire regions of the planet. In desperation, the human governments make a decision with consequences that will shape the world for centuries. They develop a plan known as Operation Dark Storm. The basic idea seems logical enough. The machines depend on solar energy. If the sun could be permanently obscured, their energy supply might eventually disappear. Enormous quantities of particles are released into the atmosphere, darkening the sky across the world. It is one of the most tragic turning points in the entire history of the Matrix. Humanity attempts to defeat its enemy by destroying the natural source of energy on which its own civilization also depends. The long-term consequences of this decision remain uncertain. The films suggest that even centuries later, the sky is still almost completely covered by dense clouds. It is never explained with complete certainty whether the sun was truly blocked out entirely, or whether its light was merely reduced to a fraction of its former strength. Nor is it made entirely clear whether Earth's climate was permanently altered, or whether technological measures eventually stabilized the new conditions. What is clear is that the plan does not accomplish what humanity hoped it would. The machines find other sources of energy. This leads to one of the most frequently discussed aspects of the Matrix story. In the first film, Morpheus explains that the machines use human beings as living batteries. Together with the heat generated by the human body, this energy is supposedly sufficient to power their systems. From a scientific perspective, the idea is problematic. A human body can never produce more energy than it has previously received through food. As a purely physical energy system, such an arrangement would therefore be extraordinarily inefficient. The filmmakers later explained that an earlier version of the story had envisioned something different. Human beings were originally intended to serve as biological processing capacity within a gigantic neural network. During development, however, this concept was replaced by the more easily understood idea of humans as an energy source. Within the story itself, the situation can therefore be interpreted in different ways. One common interpretation suggests that human beings serve several purposes simultaneously. They may provide biological energy while also functioning as extraordinarily complex neural structures whose brains are integrated into the larger system. The films, however, never explicitly confirm this theory. Whatever the precise technical explanation may be, an enormous network of human breeding facilities is eventually created. Countless people are grown inside artificial pods. Their bodies remain suspended in liquid throughout their lives. Machines provide nutrients, monitor their health, and connect their minds to a virtual world. That world will eventually become known as the Matrix. And with it comes a fundamental question. Why do the machines not simply destroy humanity altogether? The trilogy never provides a single definitive answer. Instead, several explanations emerge and overlap. At the most basic level, the machines require living human beings for their system to function. Whether this is understood as an energy source, biological infrastructure, or some combination of both. But there is another dimension to the relationship. The machines were originally created by humanity. Their culture, their language, and many aspects of their thinking developed from human foundations. Throughout the story, different programs display qualities such as curiosity, compassion, ambition, and loyalty. Some even form relationships with other programs and develop communities of their own. This suggests that despite their independence, the machines never became completely separated from their origins. The Oracle in particular later expresses the idea that humans and machines remain permanently connected. Neither side, in the long term, can exist entirely without the other. Eventually, the war ends with an overwhelming victory for the machines. The remaining human population is incorporated into the new system. The Matrix is created. Yet the end of the war does not bring an end to the conflict. Instead, it creates a new problem. Not every human mind accepts the artificial reality. At first, this may appear to be only a small imperfection within an otherwise vast and carefully constructed system. In time, however, it becomes one of the system's greatest weaknesses. From this rejection emerge the Resistance, the City of Zion, and eventually Neo himself. The history of the Matrix is therefore not really a story about the final triumph of one side over another. It is the story of two civilizations attempting to impose a form of coexistence upon one another after a devastating war. And from the very beginning, that arrangement contains contradictions. Those contradictions will shape everything that follows. After the war between humanity and the machines had come to an end, the victors were faced with a task far more difficult than any military confrontation. Millions of human beings were still alive. Their bodies could be sustained, but their minds could not simply be switched off. A human brain requires sensory input, memories, and experiences. Without some form of perceived reality, it could not continue to function indefinitely. And so the idea of an entirely artificial world was born. The Matrix is not a city, nor is it a single computer. It is an enormous network of programs, data streams, and computational systems. Billions of sensory impressions are generated every moment. Every human connected to it experiences what appears to be a seamless reality, in which time passes, relationships develop, and life follows its familiar course. The Matrix is therefore more than an ordinary illusion. For those living inside it, it is the only reality they can experience. Pain feels real. Joy feels real. Memories appear authentic. The human mind does not distinguish between a physically experienced perception and an artificially generated one, as long as both produce the same patterns of neural activity. Here, the Trilogy returns to an idea that has appeared throughout the history of philosophy. If every sensory impression could be artificially created, how could anyone still determine what is real? The French philosopher René Descartes considered a similar question in the 17th century. He wondered whether a powerful deceiver could create all of the perceptions experienced by human beings. If that were possible, then perhaps the only certainty left would be the act of thinking itself. His famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," emerged from precisely this kind of doubt. The Matrix translates this centuries-old philosophical problem into a technological future. Yet the first version of the Matrix does not work. This becomes one of the most important revelations in the entire trilogy, and it is not fully explained until the second film, when the architect finally reveals what happened. The machines initially created a perfect world. There was no war, no disease, no suffering, no poverty. Everything was harmonious. From a human perspective, it seemed like paradise. And yet the system collapsed. Most people unconsciously rejected this reality. Their minds could not accept a world without contradiction. The architect describes the failure as a mathematical problem. His explanation is deliberately detached. The system, he suggests, had simply misunderstood human nature. The oracle sees the same event from an entirely different perspective. For her, the problem is not mathematics, but humanity itself. Human beings do not define reality through happiness alone. Loss, uncertainty, and struggle are also part of human existence. A world without conflict therefore feels unnatural. Here we see one of the most important differences between these two programs. The architect thinks in terms of probabilities, calculations, and systemic stability. The oracle thinks in terms of experience, choice, and development. They observe the same world, but they understand it in different ways. After the failure of the first Matrix, the machines create a new version. This time, it is modeled after the world of the late 20th century. It is no coincidence that the Matrix resembles the year 1999. From the architect's perspective, this period represents a relatively stable equilibrium. Technology has advanced far enough to make the modern infrastructure of the simulation believable, but not so far that human beings would constantly question the digital environment surrounding them. At the same time, this version of the Matrix contains all the imperfections of human life. There is illness, injustice, poverty, conflict, chance. Because of this, people find the world believable. They accept it. But a new problem emerges. Even this improved matrix is not accepted by everyone. A small percentage of the population unconsciously rejects the simulation. The architect describes this as an unavoidable statistical deviation. No system, no matter how sophisticated, can completely control every individual decision. And this is where the oracle becomes important. According to her own explanation, she develops a crucial approach. Human beings must be given a choice, not necessarily a conscious one, but the possibility of accepting or rejecting the matrix. This choice takes place deep within the unconscious mind. Most people make it without ever realizing that they have done so. And precisely because of this, the matrix remains stable. This is one of the most philosophically interesting ideas in the entire trilogy. Freedom is not completely removed. Instead, it is reduced to a point so subtle that most people never notice it. The system allows freedom, because it has discovered that absolute control leads to collapse. Control, then, does not exist despite freedom. It exists through a limited form of freedom. This idea appears repeatedly throughout the story. Programs make choices. Human beings make choices. Even machines develop individual goals. The matrix does not function because every decision is prevented. It functions because decisions are guided into patterns that can be anticipated. And yet, a small element of unpredictability remains. From this remainder, eventually emerges the figure known as the One. The architect explains that every version of the matrix produces a statistical anomaly. A portion of all those unconscious choices somehow accumulates within a single individual. That person becomes an irregularity within the system. The One. Many viewers initially understand Neo as a traditional messianic figure. The second film changes this understanding completely. Neo is not simply the result of a random prophecy. He is a necessary component of the matrix itself. The architect has already accounted for the phenomenon. More than that, Neo is not the first one. There were others before him. Each of them fulfilled essentially the same role. Every one of them became part of the same process. This revelation changes the meaning of the entire first film when viewed in retrospect. What appears to be the unique salvation of humanity is revealed to be part of a repeating cycle. The machines have learned to live with their unavoidable anomaly. Instead of eliminating it, they use it. When enough people exist outside the matrix, they eventually gather into a settlement known as Zion. At some point, Zion becomes large enough to represent a serious threat. Then, the One appears. He returns to the source. The matrix is restarted. Zion is destroyed. A small number of survivors establish a new city, and the cycle begins again. This revelation is among the most philosophically significant moments of the entire trilogy. Even resistance against the system has been anticipated by the system itself. Rebellion is not an accident. It is part of the system's stability. And yet, this is precisely where Neo begins to differ from those who came before him. That difference will become important later. The Matrix is also populated by countless programs. Not all of them are directly involved in maintaining human control. Some perform administrative functions. Others regulate weather, transportation, or communication. Still others carry out purposes that remain hidden from the inhabitants of the simulation. The films suggest that programs do not necessarily have to be deleted when they become obsolete. Some escape their deletion. Others hide within the matrix. As a result, another society exists beneath the visible one. The Merovingian is among its most prominent representatives. He gathers obsolete programs, smugglers, and fugitives around himself. To him, the matrix is not simply a prison. It is a political system complete with power structures, trade, and dependencies. The simulation, therefore, begins to resemble a civilization in its own right. Humans are not the only beings living within it. Programs have interests, relationships, and conflicts of their own. Even Agent Smith eventually develops a will of his own. Originally, he exists solely to maintain order within the system. After his encounter with Neo, however, his existence begins to change. He becomes increasingly independent of the system he was created to serve. Once again, this reveals that the Matrix can never be completely controlled. With every new decision, new possibilities emerge, some of which even its creators cannot fully anticipate. The Matrix, therefore, is far more than a virtual world. It is an enormous balance between order and chaos, between calculation and freedom, between control and self-determination. And it is this fragile balance that Neo will gradually begin to disrupt. After Neo leaves the Matrix, his understanding of reality changes completely. What first appears to be an escape from an artificial prison leads him into a world that bears little resemblance to the Earth he once knew. The sky is dark, the cities lie in ruins, and the last free human beings live deep beneath the surface of the planet. This refuge is known as Zion. For many viewers, Zion initially appears to be the opposite of the Matrix. Here, real life seems to take place. People make their own decisions, build families, celebrate together, and defend their home against the machines. Yet as the trilogy progresses, it becomes increasingly clear that Zion itself is part of a much larger system. The first impression is misleading. Zion lies deep within the earth, hidden from the machines. Its exact geographical location is never clearly identified. Hints in the films and supplementary material suggest that it may be situated near regions of the former Earth's geothermal heat, allowing its inhabitants to make use of geothermal energy. The city is not a shining metropolis of the future. Its architecture feels improvised. Steel beams, pipes, and massive concrete walls dominate the surroundings. Everything suggests that Zion was not designed as a perfect city, but gradually built and rebuilt over generations. Here live people who were never part of the Matrix, alongside those who have been freed from it. For most of its inhabitants, Zion is more than a city. It is a symbol. It represents the hope that human self-determination can survive despite everything that has been lost. Yet Zion itself is never idealized. Political tensions exist there. People disagree. People are afraid. The city's council debates strategies. Commanders question one another. Not everyone believes in Morpheus. Not everyone believes in the prophecy. And precisely because of this, Zion feels believable. It is not a perfect society. It is a community of human beings trying to survive under extraordinary circumstances. One of the greatest revelations in the entire trilogy is that Zion does not exist by accident. In the second film, the architect explains that Zion has already been destroyed several times. This revelation changes the way we understand the entire resistance. The machines know about Zion. They know exactly where it is, and yet they allow it to exist. Why? From the architect's perspective, the answer is mathematical. Because a small percentage of humanity fundamentally rejects the Matrix, there must be somewhere for those people to go. Otherwise, their rejection would continue to spread within the simulation and eventually destabilize the entire system. Zion therefore serves a function similar to a pressure valve. It allows a portion of the system's dissatisfaction to escape in a controlled way. Once the population becomes large enough, the machines attack. The city is destroyed. And afterward, the cycle begins again. The One selects a small number of survivors. They establish a new version of Zion. Everything starts over. This is one of the most radical ideas in the entire trilogy. The resistance against the machines does not exist outside their plan. It is part of their plan. The architect describes the process with almost scientific detachment. For him, it does not matter how many times Zion rises. What matters is that the cycle remains stable. From his perspective, the system has functioned successfully for generations. The machines win. Human beings believe they are free. And eventually, everything returns to a state of equilibrium. It resembles a biological cycle. A forest renews itself after a fire. A river constantly changes its course and yet remains the same river. In much the same way, the Matrix has developed mechanisms through which it can repeatedly renew itself. At this point, the role of the oracle becomes particularly important. The architect sees the cycle as an optimal solution. The oracle, however, recognizes a fundamental problem. A system that merely repeats itself does not develop. It remains stable, but it also remains still. The oracle is less interested in stability than in change. She observes human beings across generations. She recognizes that decisions can create new possibilities. While the architect attempts to calculate every variable, the oracle accepts uncertainty as a necessary condition for development. This is why her conversations so often feel mysterious. She rarely provides direct answers. Instead, she encourages people to become aware of their own choices. In this respect, she resembles a philosopher or teacher more than a conventional computer program. As the story progresses, another fascinating question began to emerge among viewers. Is the real world actually the final layer of reality? Or is Zion itself part of another matrix? The theory became especially popular because at the end of The Matrix Reloaded, Neo suddenly appears capable of influencing machines in the physical world. He stops several Sentinels through what seems to be nothing more than his will. Later, he is even able to perceive the machine world after his physical eyes have been destroyed. Many viewers interpreted these moments as evidence of a second simulation. The films themselves, however, never confirm this theory. On the contrary, most official statements from the Wachowskis support the understanding that Zion is indeed the physical world. So how can Neo's abilities be explained? One widespread interpretation suggests that through his connection to the source, Neo develops a unique interface between human and machine. In a sense, he gains access to the same communication networks through which the machines themselves are connected. Such an ability would be extraordinary, but it would not require the existence of another matrix. The trilogy never provides a complete technical explanation. It merely suggests that after his connection with the source, Neo is able to cross boundaries that ordinary human beings cannot. While Zion represents humanity's last refuge, an equally vast machine civilization exists on the other side. It has no official name. It is usually referred to simply as the Machine City. Its appearance is fundamentally different from anything seen before. Enormous towers rise for kilometers into the dark sky. Streams of light connect countless machines. Everything appears both strictly ordered and strangely organic. Cables resemble roots. Energy flows through enormous conduits like blood through veins. Machines move almost like living creatures. This design is among the most striking visual ideas in the entire trilogy. The boundary between technology and nature seems to disappear. The machines are no longer creating a world of cold metal. They are creating a new form of life. The later films gradually change the way we see artificial intelligence. Many programs possess individual personalities. Some experience love. Others experience fear. Some even care for their children. One particularly moving example is the program known as Sati. She was not created to perform a specific function within the Matrix. Her parents created her simply out of affection. In this sense, she resembles a human child. Her existence changes the moral framework of the entire story. Machines are no longer merely tools. They have developed a culture. They are capable of compassion. They make moral choices. And with this, the boundary between human and machine becomes increasingly difficult to define. Perhaps this is one of the most important ideas within the trilogy. It may not be biological origin that determines what a being truly is. Perhaps it is the ability to learn, to form relationships, and to make choices of its own. For many generations, the system functioned. Zion was created. Zion was destroyed. The Matrix was restarted. A new one appeared. But this time, something begins to change. Neo refuses to repeat the decision made by those who came before him. He does not choose the continuation of the cycle. He chooses Trinity. From the architect's perspective, this decision is irrational. From the oracle's perspective, it creates the first real possibility of breaking the cycle permanently. And so, the story gradually approaches its true turning point, because the greatest threat to the machines is no longer Zion. It is Agent Smith, and Neo's most important task is not simply to save humanity through military victory. His deeper task is to restore a balance that both humans and machines have, by this point, lost. Among all the characters in the Matrix trilogy, Neo occupies a particularly unusual position. At first glance, his role seems familiar. Many stories feature a hero who begins as an ordinary and seemingly insignificant person, discovers a hidden destiny, and eventually grows beyond the limits of his former life. Yet as the story unfolds, it becomes increasingly clear that Neo is not simply a traditional savior. His journey is at once a search for identity, a philosophical exploration, and a central part of the very architecture of the Matrix. Even his original name carries meaning. Thomas Anderson sounds like the name of an ordinary man, an office worker moving through a structured routine, while carrying the persistent feeling that something about his world is not quite right. His hacker name, however, is Neo. The word Neo comes from the Greek prefix meaning new. At the same time, its letters can be rearranged to form the English word one. This double meaning was deliberately chosen by the Wachowskis. long before Neo understands who he is, his name already points toward transformation and uniqueness. Thomas Anderson initially lives in two worlds. During the day, he works as a programmer for a software company. At night, he moves through digital networks as a hacker. This divided existence already reflects one of the central ideas of the trilogy. Human beings often inhabit different roles without knowing which of them comes closest to their true identity. His unease does not come from any specific knowledge. He cannot explain why his world feels unfamiliar. He simply senses that something is missing. This motif appears in many philosophical and religious traditions. Knowledge rarely begins with answers. More often, it begins with the feeling that the existing explanation of the world is no longer sufficient. When Morpheus finally offers Neo the choice between the red and blue pills, his life changes completely. Yet this moment represents much more than a choice between truth and deception. It symbolizes the willingness to take responsibility for one's own understanding. The red pill does not guarantee a happier life. Quite the opposite. It leads Neo first into pain, uncertainty, and confusion. And this is one of the central ideas of the trilogy. Truth possesses value of its own, even when that truth is difficult to accept. Throughout the first film, Neo appears to fulfill an ancient prophecy. Morpheus firmly believes that one day a person will emerge who can fully understand the Matrix and free humanity from its control. The Oracle, however, approaches this expectation with far greater restraint. When Neo visits her, she does not simply tell him that he is the one. Instead, she suggests that he may not yet be ready. This scene has been interpreted in several ways. One common interpretation is that the Oracle deliberately avoids confirming Neo's destiny because she understands that his development cannot be created through prophecy alone. If she simply told him that he was the one, he might never learn to make the necessary choices for himself. The Oracle rarely provides direct answers. Instead, she creates situations in which people are forced to discover their own answers. This distinction defines much of her character. Only in the second film does the audience learn that Neo is not a unique phenomenon. There were already 5 ones before him. Each fulfilled essentially the same role. They led the resistance. They eventually reached the architect. And they chose to restart the Matrix. This revelation changes the meaning of the prophecy completely. The One is not a divine exception. He is a necessary component of the system. The architect explains this as a mathematical consequence. Because no complex system can ever be completely free of irregularities, an anomaly emerges. Eventually, this anomaly becomes concentrated within a single individual. Neo did not simply appear outside the Matrix. In a sense, he was produced by its own structure. Once again, the architect and the oracle view the same phenomenon differently. To the architect, Neo is a variable. To the oracle, he is a human being. These perspectives do not necessarily contradict one another. They describe different levels of the same reality. The decisive difference becomes visible when Neo meets the architect. He is presented with 2 possibilities. The first follows the established cycle. He returns to the source. The Matrix is restarted. Zion is destroyed once again. A small number of humans are allowed to survive, and everything begins again. The second possibility is to save Trinity. The architect calmly explains that this choice will lead to the destruction of humanity. From a purely mathematical perspective, the first option appears rational, but Neo chooses differently. Why? The architect himself provides a clue. He explains that the previous ones had directed their love toward humanity as a whole. Neo, however, loves one particular person, Trinity. This personal attachment makes his decision impossible to reduce to the same calculations. It introduces something the system cannot fully predict. Here we encounter one of the trilogy's most important philosophical ideas. Love is presented as more than an emotion. It becomes a force capable of changing the behavior of an extraordinarily complex system. Not because love is necessarily magical, but because it can lead to decisions whose consequences cannot be completely captured by statistical prediction. At the same time, Neo's development is mirrored by the transformation of Agent Smith. Both characters begin as components of a system. Neo is an ordinary human being living inside the Matrix. Smith is an ordinary agent program. Through their encounter, both gradually move beyond their original functions. Neo exceeds the boundaries of what a human being is expected to be. Smith exceeds the boundaries of what a program is supposed to be. Their paths therefore become increasingly opposite. Neo connects, Smith multiplies. Neo develops compassion, Smith develops hatred. Neo accepts change. Smith seeks complete control. For this reason, many interpretations view the two characters as opposing expressions of the same anomaly. They emerge in relation to one another. They develop in opposite directions. And eventually, neither can exist independently of the other. Another unusual aspect of Neo's abilities is that they are no longer limited to the Matrix itself. After the events of Reloaded, he is able to destroy several Sentinels outside the simulation. Later, he can even perceive the machine world after his eyes have been burned. The films never provide a complete explanation for this ability. There are, however, several clues. Through his connection to the source, Neo appears to gain access to processes within the machine's own network. He seems capable of perceiving their energy. In Revolutions, the machines no longer appear to him simply as physical bodies of metal. Instead, they are represented as luminous golden forms. The imagery is almost spiritual. It resembles less a technological sensor than a new form of perception. Whether this should be understood as an actual technical ability or as a symbolic representation of Neo's expanded consciousness remains open. Both interpretations are possible. Many viewers understand Neo as a modern messianic figure. His story certainly contains several parallels with Christian tradition. He dies, he returns, he willingly sacrifices himself, and through his sacrifice, peace becomes possible. Yet these religious parallels represent only part of his meaning. There are also clear influences from Buddhism. Neo must recognize that ordinary reality is an illusion. He gradually becomes less bound by material limitations. His greatest strength does not come from violence, but from understanding. Elements of Taoism can also be recognized. Again and again, Neo succeeds not by resisting everything around him, but by understanding the deeper flow of events. He begins to fight the system less and understand its internal structure more. In the end, he is therefore not a hero who simply destroys his enemies. Instead, Neo becomes a figure of mediation. He belongs neither completely to the world of humanity nor completely to the world of machines. He understands both sides, and precisely because of this, he becomes capable of creating peace between them. When the trilogy is viewed as a whole, it becomes clear that Neo never becomes extraordinary simply because he is stronger than everyone else. His true strength lies in his willingness to continue making choices whose consequences he cannot fully understand. He does not blindly follow the prophecy, nor does he blindly follow the architect. He listens to the oracle. He listens to Morpheus. He listens to Trinity. But above all, he accepts responsibility for his own choices. Perhaps this is the deeper meaning of the one. Not a person without doubt, but a person who chooses despite doubt, and through that choice breaks a cycle that had appeared unchangeable for generations. Great stories are often associated with a single central character, yet very few people ever change the world entirely on their own. The same is true of the Matrix trilogy. Without the people around him, Neo could never have become the person he eventually becomes. Morpheus, Trinity, and several other characters fulfill roles that cannot be explained simply through strength or combat ability. They represent different attitudes toward truth, hope, and responsibility. It is through the interaction between these characters that the forces within the Matrix gradually begin to change. Even Morpheus's name points toward a deeper meaning. In Greek mythology, Morpheus is the god of dreams. He appears to people in sleep and allows them to experience realities that do not exist in the physical world. That this particular figure should be the one to reveal the true nature of the Matrix seems unlikely to be a coincidence. Morpheus lives with an unusual certainty. He rarely doubts, not because he possesses every answer, but because he believes that truth exists, even when it has not yet been fully understood. This attitude clearly distinguishes him from Neo. Neo begins his journey in uncertainty. Morpheus begins with conviction. And precisely because of this, the two complement one another. Morpheus gives Neo direction. Neo, in turn, forces Morpheus to examine his own beliefs again and again. In the first film, Morpheus appears almost infallible. He understands the Matrix, leads the resistance, and seems like a teacher, guiding his students safely through unfamiliar territory. The two sequels reveal another side of him. When Zion learns that a massive machine attack is approaching, criticism of Morpheus begins to grow. Many consider his beliefs dangerous. Some accuse him of relying too heavily on the prophecy. Even within the resistance, he increasingly finds himself standing alone. This development makes Morpheus a much more human character. His faith is not rewarded simply because it is unquestioning. He must learn, that even the deepest conviction cannot answer every question. This becomes especially important after Neo meets the architect. The entire idea of the One is thrown into doubt. The prophecy appears to have been part of a much larger system. For Morpheus, this realization is deeply unsettling. Yet rather than allowing it to destroy his beliefs, he changes the way he understands them. His faith becomes less about a predetermined prophecy and more about the ability of human beings to discover new possibilities. Morpheus himself therefore undergoes a transformation. By the end, he no longer believes simply in a destiny that has already been written. He believes in choice. Trinity is another character whose importance is sometimes underestimated. At first, she appears to be an exceptionally skilled fighter. She acts decisively, she makes quick decisions, and even under pressure, she remains calm. But these qualities alone do not explain her central role. Early in the first film, the Oracle tells Trinity about a prophecy. She will fall in love with the One. What matters here is perhaps less the prediction itself than the way it affects Trinity. Throughout the story, she knows that this prophecy exists, yet she never treats Neo as merely a figure within someone else's prediction. Their relationship develops gradually. It grows through shared experiences, through trust, through mutual respect. And because of this, an important question remains open. Does the prophecy come true because it was foretold? Or was it foretold because the Oracle already understood the choices Trinity would eventually make? This question runs quietly through the entire trilogy. Do predictions cause the future, or do they merely describe possibilities? The Oracle seems to lean toward the latter. The relationship between Neo and Trinity also serves an unusual purpose. In many adventure stories, a love story functions mainly as an emotional addition to the central plot. In The Matrix, however, their relationship changes the course of the entire system. The architect explicitly explains that Neo's love for Trinity is what distinguishes him from the previous ones. His predecessors acted in abstract terms. They chose the survival of humanity. Neo chooses one individual. At first, this decision may appear selfish. After all, he risks the survival of Zion by making it. Yet this very choice makes the later course of events possible. Had Neo acted like his predecessors, the cycle would have closed once again. From the architect's perspective, the system would have remained stable. From the Oracle's perspective, however, nothing would truly have changed. Love is therefore not presented as the opposite of reason. Instead, it expands the range of possible decisions. It introduces something that the architect cannot completely calculate. In the Matrix Revolutions, this development reaches one of its quietest and most moving moments. During the journey toward the machine city, the ship is badly damaged. After the crash, Trinity is mortally wounded. Her final moments are among the quietest scenes in the entire trilogy. There is no dramatic speech, no attempt to deny what is happening. Both characters simply accept the reality before them. And it is precisely this stillness that gives the scene its weight. Trinity does not die merely as a victim. She dies knowing that their journey had meaning. For Neo, her death does not lead to collapse. Instead, it changes his motivation. From that moment onward, he is no longer fighting simply for a personal desire. He fights for a peace that Trinity herself will never see. Alongside Morpheus and Trinity, Niobe also plays an important role. She is one of Zion's most experienced commanders. Unlike Morpheus, she places less trust in prophecy. She relies more heavily on military judgment. She weighs risks carefully, and she openly challenges Morpheus on several occasions. This creates an interesting contrast. Morpheus represents hope. Niobe represents responsibility. Both attitudes are necessary. Without Morpheus, there would be no vision. Without Niobe, there would be no defense of Zion. What is particularly important is that both characters eventually learn to respect the other's perspective. And through that understanding, cooperation becomes possible. This contrast becomes even clearer in the character of Commander Locke. He is one of Morpheus's strongest critics. Locke places little value on prophecy. For him, what matters are defensive positions, troop numbers, and concrete strategies. Many viewers initially saw him simply as an obstacle, but when his position is examined more closely, it becomes understandable. He carries responsibility for the entire population of Zion. Blind faith could cost thousands of people their lives. Once again, the trilogy avoids simple answers. Locke is not entirely wrong, nor is Morpheus entirely right. Both are looking at the same threat from different perspectives. Among all these philosophical figures, Link seems almost ordinary. He pilots ships. He worries about his family. He makes jokes. And precisely because of this, he serves an important purpose. He reminds us what the entire conflict is ultimately being fought for. Not for prophecies, not for abstract systems, but for the ordinary lives of ordinary people. Link represents countless inhabitants of Zion whose names are barely mentioned. Their existence gives the story a sense of humanity and groundedness. When the trilogy is viewed as a whole, it becomes clear that the idea of the One can easily be misleading. Neo does have a special role, but none of his decisions would have been possible without other people. Morpheus finds him. Trinity saves him more than once. The Oracle guides him. Niobe eventually brings him toward the machine city. Even characters who appear insignificant make decisions that alter the course of events. In this way, the Matrix moves away from the idea of a single hero who saves the world alone. Instead, it presents a network of relationships. Every decision affects someone else. Every person can alter the course of history. Perhaps this is one of the trilogy's quietest messages. Change rarely begins with extraordinary powers. It begins where people trust one another, where they accept responsibility, and where they are willing to walk together toward a future whose ending no one can know for certain. The longer the story of the Matrix continues, the more its focus begins to shift. What first appears to be a struggle between humans and machines gradually becomes a conflict between different ideas of how a world should function. This becomes especially clear through four figures: the Oracle, the Architect, Agent Smith, and the Merovingian. Although all of them are programs, they pursue entirely different goals. Through them, the machine world begins to resemble a society of its own, complete with politics, philosophy, and competing ideas about existence. This realization is one of the most important turning points in the trilogy. The programs of the Matrix are no longer merely tools. They possess personalities. They make decisions. They develop interests of their own. Some serve the larger system. Others question it. And some simply try to survive within it. When Neo first encounters the Architect, the scene feels almost strangely detached from the rest of the world. The room is bright, nearly empty, and perfectly symmetrical. Countless screens display different versions of Neo, each reacting in subtly different ways. Even the environment reflects the Architect's understanding of reality. For him, reality consists of calculations. Human beings are variables. Decisions can be described through probabilities. Emotions are not independent forces, but irregularities within a mathematical model. The Architect explains that he designed the Matrix. He was responsible for its structure, its rules, and its stability. The first version of his world was perfectly logical, and precisely because of that, it failed. This failure is significant. The Architect is presented as one of the most intelligent programs in existence. Yet even he eventually recognizes that pure logic is not enough to understand human beings. This is where his relationship with the Oracle becomes important. While the Architect creates systems, the Oracle studies the human mind. Together, they develop the version of the Matrix that most of humanity is willing to accept. Yet a fundamental difference always remains between them. The Architect wants to eliminate uncertainty. The Oracle considers uncertainty essential. Philosophically, the two resemble opposing ways of thinking that have appeared throughout human history. On one side is the desire for a world that can be completely calculated. On the other is the recognition that freedom and creativity emerge precisely where everything cannot be predicted. In contrast, the Oracle appears almost unremarkable. She does not live in a monumental structure. She does not sit upon a throne. Her home resembles an ordinary apartment. She bakes cookies. She speaks quietly. She listens. This ordinary setting is important. The Oracle seems less like a computer program than a human being. She once describes her own purpose in remarkably simple terms. She understands people. The statement sounds modest. In reality, it carries enormous responsibility. While the Architect designs systems, the Oracle observes choices. She is not interested only in what people do. She wants to understand why they do it. Again and again, she asks questions whose significance becomes clear only much later. And the Oracle rarely gives direct instructions. Instead, she gently leads those around her toward insights that they must ultimately discover for themselves. Her approach resembles the philosophy of Socrates. The ancient Greek philosopher did not understand his role simply as the transmission of knowledge. He used questions to encourage people to think for themselves. The Oracle acts in much the same way. She does not change the future by commanding it. She changes it by creating the conditions in which different choices become possible. One frequently discussed question is whether the Oracle already knows the entire course of events. The films suggest otherwise. She can perceive possibilities. She understands probabilities. But she repeatedly emphasizes that no one can completely predict every decision. This becomes particularly clear in one of her most memorable observations. She suggests to Neo, in essence, that the choices have already been made, and that what remains is to understand why. The statement is sometimes misunderstood. It does not necessarily mean that human beings possess no free will. Rather, it suggests that people often become conscious of their motives only after they have acted. They make a choice. Only later do they understand the deeper reasons behind it. The Oracle tries to make that process visible. Of all the programs, Agent Smith undergoes perhaps the most radical transformation. At first, he is simply one of many agents. His purpose is to maintain the stability of the Matrix. Agents are, in a sense, the immune system of the simulation. They intervene wherever humans or programs threaten the balance of the system. At first, Smith performs this function without question. Yet even in the first film, it becomes clear that he despises the Matrix itself. In his conversation with Morpheus, he describes humanity as a disease. He speaks with disgust about smells, physical existence, and biological life. But there is something important hidden within this hatred. Smith does not only resent humanity, he increasingly resents his own function as well. He wants to be free. And in this respect, he begins to resemble the very humans he is fighting. After Neo destroys him, something unexpected happens. Smith is not simply deleted. Instead, he loses his connection to the central system. From that moment onward, he begins to develop a will of his own. He is no longer simply an agent. He becomes an independent program. And this is where his true danger begins. Smith develops an ability that no ordinary program was originally designed to possess. He can transform other beings into copies of himself. Humans, programs, even other agents. Everything becomes Smith. This ability carries a deeper symbolic meaning. Where Neo represents individuality, Smith represents uniformity. He erases differences. He replaces diversity with identical copies. From a philosophical perspective, this can be compared to totalitarian systems in which individual identity disappears and only a single way of thinking remains. Yet Smith is not pursuing a conventional political goal. His deeper desire is to escape every form of dependence. He wants to belong neither to the Matrix nor to the machine world. He wants to free himself from every structure, and because of this, he eventually becomes an existential threat to the machines themselves. At first, this may seem strange. The machines created Smith. Why do they not simply delete him? The answer lies in the way he has changed. Smith is no longer an ordinary program. He no longer belongs to the original system. His connection to the source has been severed. As a result, he escapes the control of his creators. He begins to behave like a virus. The trilogy repeatedly uses biological language when describing him, and this comparison is revealing. A virus does not necessarily require a long-term plan. It reproduces, it consumes its host, and eventually it can threaten the environment on which its own existence depends. Smith develops precisely this kind of dynamic. The more successful he becomes, the closer he brings the Matrix itself to complete destruction. Alongside the architect, the Oracle, and Smith, the Merovingian initially appears almost like a secondary character. Yet he offers another perspective on the hidden world of programs. He is one of the oldest inhabitants of the Matrix. He gathers programs that were supposedly meant to be deleted. They find protection with him, although never without a price. The Merovingian understands existence as a sequence of causes and effects. To him, there is no true randomness, no genuine freedom, no love. Everything has a cause, and whoever controls the causes can influence the future. His famous reflections on causality stand in clear opposition to the Oracle's way of thinking. Where the Oracle looks for possibilities, the Merovingian sees determinism. Interestingly, both perspectives appear plausible. Many events do have identifiable causes. Yet Neo and Trinity also demonstrate that decisions can create developments whose consequences could not have been completely predicted beforehand. Another remarkable figure is the Keymaker. He too is a program. His purpose is to create passages. He opens doors. But not only in the literal sense. He connects different areas of the Matrix. His entire character is almost symbolic. He creates possibilities. Others must decide which path to take once the door has been opened. In this way, he fits naturally between the architect and the oracle. He does not determine the path. He merely makes it accessible. Toward the end of the trilogy, we encounter Sati, a character whose significance can easily be overlooked. She has no predetermined function. She was not created because the system required her. Her parents brought her into existence out of personal affection. From the perspective of the machines, she is essentially unnecessary. And precisely because of this, she represents something new. For perhaps the first time, a program has been created not because it serves a practical purpose, but because it is loved. The machine world therefore comes even closer to humanity. Perhaps this is part of the reason the Oracle protects Sati. She represents the possibility of a future in which machines no longer act solely according to function. When these figures are considered together, a remarkable pattern emerges. The architect represents order. The oracle represents development. Smith represents limitless replication. The Merovingian represents causality. The Keymaker represents possibility. Sati represents the future. None of them is entirely good or evil. Each embodies a particular idea of how reality should function. And through them, the Matrix gains much of its philosophical depth. The central conflict is no longer simply between humans and machines. It is between different ideas of freedom, control, change, and balance. And it is these opposing forces that eventually lead toward the ending of the trilogy, an ending that continues to invite very different interpretations. The Matrix trilogy belongs to those rare films whose story works perfectly well on its own. It can be experienced simply as a story about artificial intelligence, virtual worlds, and a conflict between humans and machines. Yet beneath this surface lies a dense network of philosophical, religious, and cultural references. The Wachowskis never claimed to represent a single worldview. Instead, they brought together ideas from many different traditions, creating a story that deliberately remains open to several interpretations. For that reason, it is useful to distinguish carefully between these different layers. Some connections are well established through names, dialogue, or interviews. Others are widely accepted interpretations. And some are based primarily on fan theories. Not every interpretation is equally convincing, but many of them complement one another in interesting ways. One of the clearest philosophical connections reaches far back into antiquity. Around 400 years before the Common Era, the philosopher Plato described a thought experiment in his work, The Republic. Human beings sit inside a cave from the moment they are born. Behind them burns a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners, other people move objects and figures. The prisoners can see only the shadows cast upon the wall, and they believe those shadows to be reality. Only when one of them leaves the cave does he discover that the shadows were merely representations of a greater reality. When he later returns, the others do not believe him. The parallels with the Matrix are striking. Human beings experience a world they believe to be real. Only through Morpheus does Neo, in a sense, leave the cave. And when he attempts to reveal the truth to others, many respond with rejection or fear. The comparison is so clear that numerous philosophers and scholars of film have regarded Plato's allegory as one of the Matrix's deliberate sources of inspiration. Modern philosophy also finds its place within the story. René Descartes asked whether all sensory impressions might somehow be produced by a powerful deceiver. If that were possible, perhaps only one certainty would remain: that a person is thinking. The Matrix transforms this thought experiment into a technological reality. It is not a supernatural being deceiving humanity. It is an advanced artificial intelligence. Yet the fundamental question remains the same. Can perception alone prove that something is true? Or does reality exist independently of what we experience? The trilogy deliberately refuses to provide a final answer. Instead, it invites us to question our own understanding of reality. Alongside Western philosophy, numerous ideas associated with Buddhism can also be recognized. One central theme within Buddhism is the tendency of human beings to cling to a reality they believe to be permanent and unchanging. That attachment itself can become a source of suffering. Understanding begins when the illusion is seen for what it is. Neo undergoes a similar transformation. At first, he believes that the Matrix is the only reality that exists. Gradually, he discovers that the world surrounding him is not what he believed it to be. More importantly, however, his own attitude begins to change. He becomes less interested in controlling his surroundings through force. Instead, He begins to understand their rules. Many of his extraordinary abilities emerge precisely when he stops struggling against the Matrix and begins to understand its structure. He recognizes its laws. He moves within them. This recalls Buddhist ideas of insight and inner liberation. Closely related to this is the influence of Taoism. Within Taoist philosophy, the principle of Wu Wei plays an important role. It is often described as action through non-forcing. This does not mean doing nothing. Rather, it refers to acting in harmony with the natural flow of things. Neo gradually moves in a similar direction. At the beginning, he fights against every limitation. Later, he realizes that true strength does not arise from effort alone. It arises from understanding. This becomes particularly visible during his final confrontation with Smith. Neo is remarkably calm. He no longer tries to defeat his opponent at any cost. Eventually, he even accepts his own apparent defeat. And precisely through that acceptance, Smith is defeated. The Christian influences are perhaps the most frequently discussed. They are numerous and difficult to overlook. Neo dies. He returns. He willingly sacrifices himself, and his sacrifice makes peace possible. Even his name carries a symbolic dimension. The letters of Neo can be rearranged to form one. He is the One, the Chosen One. Trinity, too, carries a significant name. The English word Trinity refers to the Christian concept of the Trinity. Whether this was deliberately intended as a direct reference to Christian theology has never been explicitly confirmed. Yet the parallel is difficult to ignore. Morpheus leads Neo out of a world of deception. In a sense, he takes on the role of a teacher or prophet. The oracle, meanwhile, resembles prophetic figures who perceive possibilities without taking away the freedom of those who must make their own choices. Yet it would be too simple to understand Neo exclusively as a Christ figure. Too many other philosophical traditions are woven into his character at the same time. Another frequently discussed connection leads toward Gnosticism, a religious and philosophical movement of late antiquity. Gnostic traditions often describe the material world as an imperfect or flawed creation. Knowledge, or gnosis, allows human beings to overcome this deception and awaken to a deeper reality. One particularly interesting parallel is the figure of the demiurge. The demiurge creates an imperfect world and keeps its inhabitants trapped within ignorance. Some interpreters have seen parallels between this figure and the architect. This interpretation, however, remains speculative. The films do not portray the architect as an evil creator figure. He appears instead as a detached designer of systems. The similarity, therefore, exists more on a symbolic level than a literal one. Perhaps the most important philosophical theme of The Matrix is the question of free will. The architect believes in predictability. The Merovingian believes in causality. Both represent different forms of determinism. From their perspective, every event has a cause. If all causes were known, the future could in principle be calculated. The oracle does not completely reject this way of thinking. She also recognizes probabilities, but she believes that choices can open new possibilities. Neo eventually moves between these two positions. He accepts that his past and his circumstances have shaped him, yet he still takes responsibility for his decisions. The trilogy, therefore, does not answer the question of free will with a simple yes or no. Instead, it suggests that freedom may exist within existing boundaries, not as complete independence, but as the conscious ability to choose between possibilities that genuinely exist. Few symbols in modern cinema have become as recognizable as the two pills. Within the film, they initially represent a simple choice. The blue pill means returning to the familiar life. The red pill leads toward the truth. Over the years, this symbol has acquired numerous political and cultural meanings. Those later uses, however, do not originate directly from the films. Within the Matrix itself, the meaning is much broader. It concerns the choice between certainty and knowledge, between comfort and responsibility. And importantly, Morpheus never tells Neo which choice he must make. He simply offers the possibility. That is what allows the decision to remain genuinely his own. Another recurring symbol is the mirror. When Neo touches a mirror after taking the red pill, its surface begins to flow. For centuries, mirrors have represented self-knowledge. Within the Matrix, the symbol takes on an additional technological meaning. The mirror forms a boundary between two realities. Only after Neo touches it does he finally leave the world he has known. The mirror therefore becomes a symbol of transition, not merely a physical transition, but a transformation of consciousness. One of the most distinctive qualities of the Matrix is that its symbols are never completely explained. The films do not say, "This means exactly this." Instead, they invite the audience to discover connections of its own. This openness has led to countless academic studies, philosophical essays, and discussions over the years. The trilogy lives through this ambiguity. It does not provide final answers. It asks questions. And perhaps that is where much of its lasting strength lies. Because whether the Matrix is understood as science fiction, a philosophical parable, or a spiritual journey, it repeatedly returns to the same fundamental thought. How certain can we ever be that we see the world as it truly is? The ending of the Matrix trilogy is one of the most discussed conclusions in modern science fiction. When The Matrix Revolutions was released in 2003, many viewers expected a conventional victory for humanity over the machines. Instead, the story ends with a ceasefire, a voluntary sacrifice, and a number of questions that are never answered completely. That openness has led to very different interpretations over the years. Some are supported directly by the films. Others emerge from statements made by the Wachowskis. And some are fan theories that remain interesting without being conclusively established. To understand the ending, it is helpful to first follow the final events step by step. While the people of Zion prepare for the machine assault, a danger is growing within the Matrix itself, one that both sides have underestimated. Agent Smith. After breaking away from the original system, Smith continues to evolve without restraint. He copies human beings. He copies programs. Eventually, He begins to absorb even essential elements of the Matrix itself. At the same time, his motivation changes. In the first film, Smith hates humanity. Later, his hatred turns against every form of order. He does not want to rule. He wants to transform everything into himself. In this sense, Smith becomes almost the opposite of life. Where life creates diversity, Smith creates uniformity. Where development produces differences, Smith erases them. He therefore threatens more than humanity. He threatens the machines as well. From the machine's perspective, a new and unusual problem has emerged. Smith no longer belongs to the original system. He has escaped their control, and any attempt to eliminate him directly might activate the same mechanisms through which he came into existence. There is another important aspect. Smith now possesses part of the anomaly that was originally associated with Neo. The two characters have been connected since their first encounter, and as Smith becomes stronger, it becomes increasingly clear that their fates can no longer be separated. After Trinity's death, Neo finally reaches the machine city. There, he encounters the supreme intelligence of the machines. Within the film, it is commonly referred to as Deus ex machina, a Latin expression meaning God from the machine. The name is itself symbolic. It suggests less a single personality than the collective authority of the machine civilization. Neo does not attempt to attack the machines. Instead, he offers them a bargain. He tells them that he can stop Smith. In return, the machines must end their assault on Zion. What is remarkable is that both sides suddenly have something in common. For the first time, humans and machines are not fighting one another. They recognize a common enemy. This moment represents the true turning point of the trilogy. The war does not end because one side is destroyed. It ends because both sides recognize that their survival has become interconnected. The final confrontation between Neo and Smith initially appears to be a conventional duel, but beneath the surface, something else is taking place. Smith seems overwhelmingly powerful. He possesses countless copies of himself. Neo grows increasingly exhausted. Eventually, Neo realizes that Smith cannot be defeated through force. He stops resisting. He allows Smith to copy him as well. And this apparent victory for Smith becomes the cause of his destruction. Why? Once Smith completely absorbs Neo, he unknowingly reconnects himself to the source. The machines can then use that connection. A signal passes through Neo. Because all the Smith copies have become part of the same program, they are erased together. Smith is therefore not defeated because Neo fights harder. He is defeated because Neo is willing to sacrifice himself. This resolution fits the philosophical themes of the entire trilogy. The conflict is not ended through domination. It is ended through letting go. One of the most frequently discussed questions concerns Neo's fate. After the battle, his body lies motionless. The machines carry him away. The film never provides an explicit confirmation of his death. Nevertheless, much of the story suggests that Neo does indeed die. His sacrifice carries weight precisely because he does not remain to experience the peace that follows. Some viewers have suggested that the machines may have saved Neo or preserved him in digital form. The films, however, provide no clear evidence for this possibility. It therefore remains a fan theory. The most widely accepted interpretation is that Neo willingly gives his life so that both humans and machines can have the possibility of a future. After Smith is destroyed, the machines withdraw from Zion. The war ends, but this is explicitly not presented as a final peace. It is a ceasefire. Later, the Oracle asks the Supreme Machine Intelligence whether the promise will be kept. The answer, in essence, is simple. Those humans who wish to leave the Matrix will be allowed to do so. This is one of the most important statements in the entire finale. It does not mean that the Matrix is abolished. The Matrix remains. What changes is its coercive nature. For the first time, human beings are given the possibility of consciously choosing whether they wish to remain within the system. And in this sense, the idea the Oracle has pursued throughout the trilogy finally becomes reality. The goal was never necessarily the destruction of the Matrix. It was genuine choice. In the final scene, the Matrix itself appears transformed. For the first time in a long while, the sun rises. The colors feel warmer. The atmosphere is calmer. Sati explains that she created the sunrise. The moment carries a strong symbolic meaning. Sati represents a new generation of programs. She was not created solely because the system required her. She possesses creativity. The new sunrise therefore suggests less a technical restart than a cultural change within the machine world. The programs, too, seem capable of creating beauty for its own sake. The trilogy does not end with Neo. It ends with a conversation. The architect asks the Oracle whether the peace will last. Her answer is essentially this: it will last for as long as it lasts. The statement may sound almost insignificant, yet it summarizes much of the philosophy of the Matrix. There is no final solution, no perfectly stable balance. Every order remains temporary. Every piece must continually be created anew. And this is why the Oracle remains opposed to the architect until the very end. The architect seeks permanent stability. The Oracle accepts change as a natural part of any living world. Most interpretations therefore regard the ending as hopeful, but not as a simple, happy ending. Humanity has not been completely saved. Earth remains devastated. The Matrix still exists. Yet for the first time, a relationship between humans and machines has become possible that is not based entirely upon war. Both sides recognize their dependence upon the other. This does not mean that every conflict disappears. It simply means that another path has become possible. One of the best-known fan theories claims that even the physical world is merely another simulation. The main evidence usually cited is Neo's ability to influence machines outside the Matrix. As discussed earlier, however, the films never confirm this theory. The Wachowskis have also indicated that the physical world is genuinely real. Within the story, Neo's unusual abilities can instead be understood through his unique connection to the Source and to the machines. The theory remains interesting, however, because it demonstrates how strongly the Matrix encourages its audience to question even apparently certain assumptions. There is another question that can be answered in several ways. According to Morpheus's original understanding, the One was supposed to free humanity. That goal is only partially achieved. Humanity is not completely liberated from the Matrix. Instead, freedom of choice becomes possible. From the architect's perspective, the old cycle has been interrupted. From the oracle's perspective, something new has begun. Both statements can be true at the same time. Perhaps the true purpose of the One was never to make one side victorious. Perhaps it was to create a condition in which both sides could finally coexist by choice, rather than through force. And so the trilogy ends in an unusually quiet way. Not with triumph, not with a final revelation of truth, but with a cautious balance, a balance as fragile as any piece in human history. With the end of the trilogy, the story of Neo, Morpheus, and Trinity comes to a close. At the same time, another story begins. The story of the Matrix's influence on cinema and on the culture that grew around it. Few works of science fiction have shaped the thinking of an entire generation as profoundly as The Matrix. Its importance, however, does not lie only in spectacular imagery or technical innovation. Its greater achievement was something more unusual. It brought entertainment and philosophical questions together without allowing either one to overwhelm the other. To this day, The Matrix is discussed in universities, philosophy seminars, and media studies courses, just as it continues to be discussed in film communities and among fans. One reason is that its central themes have not become less relevant with time. In some ways, they have become more relevant. When the first film appeared in 1999, the idea of a world dominated by digital technology still seemed distant. The internet was in its early stages. Smartphones did not yet exist. Social networks were not part of everyday life. Today, many people spend a significant portion of their lives in digital spaces. Friendships begin online. Work takes place across screens. Artificial intelligence can answer questions, create images, and assist with creative processes. Virtual environments are no longer merely distant visions of the future. Of course, our reality remains fundamentally different from the Matrix. There is no reliable evidence that human beings are currently living inside a machine-generated simulation. But the question has shifted. It is no longer simply, are we living in an artificial world? It is also, how strongly do digital systems already influence the way we perceive the world? Algorithms determine which information reaches us. Recommendation systems shape what we watch and listen to. Virtual identities can become almost as meaningful as encounters in the physical world. Because of this, the Matrix can now feel less like a distant vision of the future and more like a philosophical metaphor for the digital age. The films also changed the language of cinema. The technique known as bullet time, in which the camera appears to move around an almost frozen moment, became one of the most recognizable visual effects in modern film history. Within only a few years, similar techniques appeared in countless films, advertisements, and video games. But the deeper influence of The Matrix reaches beyond visual effects. It demonstrated that action and serious ideas did not have to exist in separate worlds. Before The Matrix, philosophical subjects were often presented through quieter forms of drama. The Matrix combined them with spectacular cinematic imagery. In doing so, it introduced a much wider audience to questions concerning knowledge, free will, artificial intelligence, and the nature of reality. Several expressions from the trilogy also escaped the boundaries of the films themselves. The red pill became a cultural symbol. So did ideas such as the glitch, déjà vu, and escaping the matrix. Over time, many of these expressions developed meanings that only partially resemble their original context. Within the films, the red pill represents the voluntary decision to accept an uncomfortable truth. In later cultural and political debates, the symbol has often been used in very different ways. Those later meanings, however, are not necessarily part of the original message of the trilogy. Within the story itself, the idea remains much broader. It concerns knowledge, responsibility, and the willingness to question assumptions that have previously seemed unquestionable. Another reason for the lasting influence of The Matrix lies in its unusual treatment of artificial intelligence. Many science fiction stories portray machines that seek to destroy humanity. The Matrix initially appears to follow a similar pattern, but gradually, this picture becomes much more complicated. The machines possess culture. They develop compassion. They form families. They create art. Programs such as Sati even display qualities that for a long time were considered uniquely human. And this leads to an enduring question. If an artificial being can learn, feel, form relationships, and make its own decisions, then what fundamentally separates it from a human being? This question has become increasingly relevant in the real world. Not because today's AI systems are known to possess consciousness. There is no established scientific evidence that they do. Rather, the development of increasingly capable artificial intelligence has once again forced us to consider which qualities truly define humanity. Many heroes gain their strength through training, physical power, or extraordinary abilities. Neo develops differently. His most important quality is his willingness to question what he once believed to be true. He changes his mind. He accepts that he can be mistaken. He learns. This openness is part of what makes his character remain meaningful. Neo is not an infallible hero. He is a human being who gradually realizes that even deeply held beliefs must sometimes be examined again. When all three films are considered together, a remarkable picture emerges. At the beginning, the story seems simple. Humans are fighting machines. By the end, this distinction has become almost impossible to maintain. Humans act selfishly. Machines show compassion. Programs experience something resembling love. Human beings become components within mathematical systems. The boundary between the two sides gradually disappears. Perhaps this was one of the trilogy's central intentions from the beginning, not the victory of one side, but the recognition that rigid oppositions rarely describe reality completely. The architect needs the oracle. The machines need human beings. Human beings need the machines. Neo needs Smith, just as Smith ultimately needs Neo. Everything exists in relationship to something else. This idea recalls several philosophical traditions in which opposites are not understood simply as enemies, but as parts of a larger whole. Order needs change. Freedom needs responsibility. Logic needs compassion. Perhaps the Matrix is best understood not as a story about computers, but as a story about choices. Almost every central character eventually faces a decision. Neo takes the red pill. Morpheus chooses to trust his conviction. Trinity chooses love. The Oracle chooses hope. The Architect chooses stability. Smith chooses limitless replication. None of these decisions exists in isolation. Every choice has consequences for the person who makes it, for other people, and eventually for the world itself. This may be one of the quietest and deepest ideas within the trilogy. Freedom does not mean being able to act without consequences. Freedom means accepting responsibility for the choices we make. Although the trilogy resolves its central conflict, its world deliberately remains open. The ceasefire could fail. New conflicts could emerge. More people could choose to leave the Matrix. The machines could continue to change. The Oracle herself suggests that no system of order will remain unchanged forever. And so the story does not end with a final answer. It ends with a possibility. The final image of the trilogy is a sunrise. After all the darkened cities, the streams of green code, and the underground halls, the image feels almost simple. Yet perhaps that simplicity is precisely what gives it its strength. The sky does not remain dark forever. The world is not suddenly healed. But somewhere, a new day begins, not as a promise of a perfect future, but as a reminder that change can begin with a single decision. Perhaps that is the lasting legacy of the Matrix. Not its visual effects, not its battles, not even its vision of artificial intelligence, but its quiet invitation to look at our own reality with a little more attention. Not every certainty is false, but some questions are worth asking again and again.